The moment Myrtle Hurst stood up in the middle of the Caldwell Creek town meeting and told Warren Cooper that he was dead wrong, every jaw in the room dropped so fast it was a wonder the floorboards did not crack from the weight of all that collective astonishment. It was the autumn of 1878, and Caldwell Creek sat nestled at the edge of the Kansas plains like a stubborn burr that refused to be brushed away by the dry wind sweeping down from the north. The town was not large by any measure that mattered, but it had survived 3 brutal winters, 2 droughts, a bout of scarlet fever that had taken 4 souls in the spring, and the uncertain moods of the cattle trade that kept most of its citizens employed in one fashion or another. It had a general store run by a man named Hector Lyle, who weighed everything twice and smiled seldom, a saloon called the Golden Spur that saw more arguments than drinking on most nights, a church that Reverend Aldous Pratt kept immaculate and preached from with considerable fire, and a schoolhouse that had been built only 2 years prior with money raised through the determined effort of a few women who believed children deserved something better than scratching letters in the dirt. Myrtle Hurst had been one of those women. She had come to Caldwell Creek 3 years earlier with her father, Edmund Hurst, who had purchased 40 acres on the eastern side of the creek and intended to farm them. Edmund had done reasonably well for the first 2 years, growing enough wheat and raising enough chickens to keep himself and his daughter comfortable, though never prosperous. Then a rattlesnake had bitten him in the ankle the previous spring, and though he had survived, the infection that followed had left him weakened and partially lame, unable to walk more than a few dozen yards without stopping to rest. Since that day, Myrtle had taken on the greater share of their work, keeping the farm running through sheer stubbornness and a willingness to work from before the sun rose until long after it had set. She was 26 years old, tall for a woman of her time, with dark brown hair that she pinned up each morning with the serious intention of keeping it pinned for the rest of the day, though it rarely cooperated. Her eyes were the color of creek water in late afternoon, somewhere between gray and green depending on the light, and she had a way of looking at a thing directly that made some people nervous and others simply honest. She was not the sort of woman who sought attention or courted admiration, but she was the sort of woman who, when she had something to say, said it clearly and without apology, and that had earned her both respect and the occasional cold shoulder in a town that had complicated feelings about women who expressed opinions in public. Warren Cooper had come to Caldwell Creek 5 years before Myrtle, which made him something of an established figure in the way that 5 years in a frontier town created, if not permanence, at least a sense of belonging. He ran the largest cattle operation in the surrounding area, a spread of nearly 800 acres that he called the Double C Ranch, and he employed 11 men through the busy seasons. He was 32 years old, lean and sun-darkened from years of outdoor work, with black hair that needed cutting more often than he remembered to cut it, and dark brown eyes that tended to observe a room before committing to anything. He had grown up in Texas, learned cattle from his father and grandfather, and had moved north to Kansas when the trail drives made it sensible to be closer to the railroad towns. He was known in Caldwell Creek as a fair employer, a capable rancher, and a man whose word meant something. He was also known, though this was discussed more quietly, as a man who was accustomed to being listened to. The town meeting had been called on an October evening when the nights were beginning to sharpen with real cold, and the citizens of Caldwell Creek gathered in the church, which was the largest enclosed space available for such occasions, seated on pews and along the walls, with children kept mostly to the back and told to be quiet. The meeting had been organized to discuss the matter of the Eastern Road, which was the dirt track that connected Caldwell Creek to the larger town of Meade, 40 miles distant. The road ran through land that included the edge of Edmund Hurst's 40 acres, and it also cut across the corner of Warren Cooper's grazing range, though the impact on his spread was considerably smaller than on the Hurst farm. The matter under discussion was a proposal from Aldous Crane, who owned the livery stable and fancied himself something of a civic planner, to reroute the eastern road slightly northward, so that it would bypass a section of ground that flooded badly each spring and made the route impassable for several weeks at a time. The rerouted road would solve the flooding problem, Crane argued, and would make the route to Meade faster and more reliable for traders and travelers alike. What Crane's proposal did not particularly emphasize was that the new route would cut directly through the southern third of Edmund Hurst's wheat fields. Warren Cooper had spoken in support of Crane's proposal, and he had done so with the confident ease of a man who was used to his opinion carrying weight. He had laid out the practical advantages in clear terms, acknowledged that there would be some disruption to the affected properties, and suggested that the town could offer a modest payment to any landowner whose ground was taken for the new road. He had spoken well and reasonably, and most of the men in the room had nodded along without a great deal of argument. That was when Myrtle Hurst stood up. She did not wait to be recognized. She simply rose from her seat near the middle of the church and said, in a voice that was perfectly steady, "Mr. Cooper, you are describing fair compensation for taking a man's land, but the amount you named would not buy seed for a single season, let alone replace 3 years of field preparation. I think you have not looked carefully at what this road will actually cost the people whose land it crosses." The room went quiet in a particular way, the way that a room goes quiet when something unexpected has happened, and everyone is waiting to see what comes next. Warren Cooper turned to look at her. He had seen Myrtle Hurst before, of course, in the way that everyone in a small town had seen everyone else, and he knew she was Edmund Hurst's daughter, and that she ran the farm now that her father was ailing. He had not, however, spoken with her directly, and he had not expected her to be the person who challenged him in a public meeting. He regarded her for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between surprise and what might, in a less composed man, have been irritation. "Miss Hurst," he said carefully, "the compensation amount is a starting figure and would be open to discussion." "Then let us discuss it now," Myrtle said, and she did not sit down. "Because a starting figure that begins too low tends to end there as well, in my experience. My father's fields on the southern end of our property took 2 years to clear and grade and plant properly. That ground has been worked and turned and improved. What you are proposing to do is take that improved land, run a road through it, and hand us back money that would not cover a quarter of the labor already put into it." There was a murmur through the room. Not hostile exactly, but uncertain, the sound of people recalibrating something they had already mostly decided. Warren looked at her steadily. "The road serves the whole town," he said. "It does," Myrtle agreed, and she did not flinch from his gaze. "And the whole town should therefore bear its cost fairly, not concentrated on 2 or 3 landowners who happen to sit in the road's path. I would like to know, Mr. Cooper, whether the land adjacent to your own property was considered for this route, and if not, why not?" That was the moment that changed things, though neither of them understood it as such at the time. Warren Cooper was not a man who was often asked questions that he did not have an immediate answer to, and the truth was that he did not know precisely why the alternative routes had been discarded. He knew that Crane had presented the northern reroute as the most practical option, and he had taken that at face value because the flooding problem was real, and because the fix had seemed straightforward. He had not, he realized now, looked at a map carefully enough to see where the alternative paths might go. He had assumed the proposal was sound because Crane was knowledgeable about the roads and because the logic of it seemed clear. He had not thought to ask about whose land sat in the other possible paths. "That would require looking at the surveyor's records," he said, and his voice was measured, though a trace of something that was not quite discomfort moved through his expression. "Then I suggest we look at them before we vote," Myrtle said. "I'm not against a better road. I'm against an unfair one." She sat down. The meeting did not reach a resolution that night. Aldous Crane was flustered and defensive, but 3 other men who owned small farms agreed with Myrtle that the compensation discussion had been premature, and Reverend Pratt, who had a strong sense of fairness if nothing else, said that it seemed prudent to revisit the question with better information in hand. The vote was postponed, and the citizens of Caldwell Creek filed out into the October night with considerably more to think about than they had arrived with. Warren Cooper stood outside the church afterward, his hat in his hands, and watched Myrtle Hurst walk away with her coat pulled close against the cold. He had not been argued with like that in longer than he could recall. He was not sure whether he was annoyed or impressed or some combination of the two that had no clean name. What he was certain of was that he had not thought clearly about the Hurst farm situation before speaking tonight, and that bothered him more than the argument itself. He had been wrong. She had been right, and she had said so in front of the entire town without hesitation. He put his hat back on and walked to where his horse was tied at the hitching post, and he rode back toward the Double C Ranch under a sky so full of stars it looked like spilled salt, and he thought about gray-green eyes and a steady voice, and the specific way she had said, "I am not against a better road, I am against an unfair one." He thought about it for several days after that. Myrtle, for her part, walked home that night with her heart still beating faster than usual from the effort of standing up and speaking, which never got as easy as she told herself it would. She had not done it to be difficult. She had done it because the road, as proposed, would take the fields that she and her father had built together in the only years he had been healthy enough to build them, and she had not been willing to let that happen without at least making the argument clearly. She had not particularly thought about Warren Cooper as a person during the meeting. She had thought about the problem, which was her way. But afterward, walking home through the cool dark, she found herself thinking about the way he had looked at her when she sat back down. Not angry, not dismissive, something more complicated than either of those things. She told herself it did not matter and went home to check on her father, who had waited up by the fire and wanted to know everything that had happened. Edmund Hurst listened to his daughter's account with the satisfied expression of a man who had raised someone worth raising. He was 58 years old and moved slowly now, with a cane and a careful deliberateness that had not come naturally to a man who had spent most of his life in active motion. But his mind was clear, and his humor was intact, and he loved his daughter with a fierceness that nothing could diminish. "You told Warren Cooper he was wrong in front of the whole town," he said, and there was a smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "I told him the proposal was incomplete," Myrtle said, pouring herself a cup of water. "Same thing," Edmund said. "How did he take it?" "Better than some men would," she admitted, and she said nothing further on the subject, but she lay awake longer than usual that night, which was not something she allowed herself to do very often. The following week, Warren Cooper rode out to the Hurst farm on a Tuesday morning when the sky was the pale blue of deep autumn, and the fields were quiet with the work of the season winding down. He had not sent word ahead. He had thought about it and decided that sending word ahead was the kind of thing a man did when he was uncertain of his reception, and he wanted to be straightforward rather than careful. Myrtle was in the yard splitting wood when she heard the horse come through the gate. She turned with the axe still in her hand and watched him ride up and stop a respectful distance away, and there was a moment where neither of them said anything, and the only sound was the wind moving through the cottonwood trees at the edge of the yard. "Miss Hurst," Warren said, and he swung down from the horse and held the reins. He was wearing a plain work coat, and his hat was pushed back in a way that was either casual or nervous. She was not sure which. "I came because I owe you an apology." She rested the axe handle against the woodpile and regarded him. "What for?" "For speaking at that meeting without knowing the situation well enough," he said. "I looked at the surveyor's records. There is another possible route that would avoid your land entirely. It crosses a stretch of open ground northwest of here that nobody has filed on. It is a longer way around, but the grade is manageable. I should have known that before I opened my mouth." Myrtle looked at him for a long moment. She had met men who admitted they were wrong, but not many, and fewer still who came in person to say so without being required to. She was not quite sure what to do with it. "Did you tell Aldous Crane?" she asked. "I told him this morning," Warren said. "He was not pleased, but I think the new route will end up being the one the town chooses. The ground is solid and the flooding problem is avoided." "Then our fields are safe," Myrtle said, and some of the tension she had been holding in her shoulders for a week quietly released. "They are," Warren said. "I wanted you to know directly and to say that you were right to push back the way you did. I had not thought it through." She was quiet again for a moment. Then she said, "Would you like some coffee? It is cold and you have ridden a ways." He accepted, and he tied his horse to the fence post and followed her inside, and Edmund Hurst looked up from his chair by the fire with an expression that was perfectly neutral except for his eyes, which were several things at once. Warren stayed for nearly an hour. He and Edmund talked about the cattle trade and the railroad prices and the winter coming on, and Myrtle moved around the small kitchen refilling cups, and occasionally inserting a sentence into the conversation that shifted it somewhere more interesting. And Warren found himself watching her do this without fully realizing he was watching her. She knew things about farming costs and grain prices and water rights that he would not have expected from the limited conversation he had prepared himself for, and she expressed what she knew without performance or apology, which was unusual and more than a little arresting. When he left, he rode back toward the Double C with the distinct feeling that the morning had gone somewhere he had not anticipated, and that this was not, on reflection, a bad thing. Myrtle washed the coffee cups after he left and said nothing about the visit, and Edmund Hurst said nothing either, though he watched his daughter's face for the rest of the day with the quiet attentiveness of a man who was learning something. The town meeting reconvened 2 weeks later, and the new route was presented and accepted without significant opposition. The road would be rerouted along the northwestern path, the work to begin in the spring. The Hurst farm was untouched. Myrtle sat through the meeting quietly this time, and when it was over, Warren Cooper crossed the room to speak to her and said simply, "Good outcome." And she said, "Yes, it is." And they stood together for a moment in the way that two people stand when they are not quite sure what happens next. What happened next was November. November in Kansas was cold and serious, and the work of keeping a farm and a household and an ailing father properly organized took up the majority of Myrtle's daylight hours, and a good portion of the ones after dark. She did not have much time to think about Warren Cooper, but she thought about him more than she planned to, in the odd moments when the mind reaches for something to hold onto against the weight of practical work. She thought about the way he had ridden to the farm to apologize without being asked, which continued to sit in her chest like a small warm stone she could not quite account for. Warren, meanwhile, found reasons to ride through the eastern edge of town more often than his work strictly required. He told himself it was to check on the proposed road route, and then that it was to look at the conditions of the creek after the first heavy frost, and then he stopped making excuses to himself, because he was 32 years old and had been honest with himself about most things for most of his life, and he was not going to start lying to himself now. He was finding reasons to ride past the Hurst farm because he was hoping to see Myrtle, and that was simply the truth of it. He saw her on a Thursday in the middle of November when she was repairing a section of fence along the road-facing side of their property, working with a post driver and a box of nails in the gray morning light, and he stopped his horse and offered to help, and she accepted without making a point of it, which he appreciated. They worked together for 2 hours in the cold air, and they talked in the easy way that work alongside another person creates, without the formality that other situations require. He learned that she had come to Kansas from Ohio, that her mother had died when Myrtle was 14, that she had taught herself to read agricultural reports and land law because no one else in their household was going to, and that she had very specific opinions about the best way to brace a fence post that she was not shy about expressing. She learned that he had two brothers still in Texas, that he missed the landscape there without missing the life he had lived in it, that he had considered selling the Double C the previous year when 2 hard seasons had threatened the operation, and that he had decided against it because something about this particular stretch of land felt worth fighting for. She was not sure when the fence repair ended and the conversation became the point, but at some juncture the transition occurred, and they were leaning against the completed fence in the cold air, talking about nothing that was strictly necessary, and it was the best part of a November morning that either of them had spent in some time. He rode away with a feeling in his chest that he had not had in years. She stood at the fence a moment longer than was necessary and watched him go, and then went back inside to make her father's noon meal with her cheeks pink from the cold, and something else she was not ready to name. December came in hard, with a storm in the first week that dropped 8 inches of snow and kept most of the county indoors for the better part of 3 days. Warren sent one of his hands, a steady young man named Jonas, to check on the Hurst farm after the storm, with a note that simply said he hoped they had weathered it well and that he would be glad to help if anything needed repair. Myrtle wrote back on the back of the same paper, because paper was not wasted in frontier households, and said that they were fine and thank you, and added, almost as an afterthought, that the storm had brought down one of the larger cottonwood limbs, and if anyone had time to cut it for firewood she would not turn down the help. Warren came himself, 3 days later, with 2 of his hands, and they worked through the fallen limb in a couple of hours. He sent the hands back with the horses and stayed for supper, because Myrtle had said it was the least she could do and he had agreed, because declining would have been politely dishonest, and he had promised himself not to be dishonest with himself about this. Supper at the Hurst farm was simple but good, a beef stew with root vegetables from the cellar, bread that Myrtle had made that morning, and apple preserves she had put up in the fall. Edmund was in better spirits than he had been in weeks, energized by company, and he told stories about his early years in Ohio and his decision to come west that were funny and self-deprecating, and made Warren laugh genuinely several times. Myrtle watched her father be happy in the way that adult children watch their parents recover something, with a tender relief that she kept behind her expression, but that Warren caught a glimpse of anyway and filed away without comment. When Warren put on his coat to leave, Edmund said, with the absolute casualness of a man who had thought carefully about how to sound casual, "You should come for Christmas dinner if you have no other plan." Warren looked at Myrtle, who was standing near the door with a lamp, and she met his eyes and said nothing, but she also did not argue with her father, which he was beginning to understand was its own form of communication with her. "I would like that," Warren said. "Thank you, Mr. Hurst." He walked out into the cold December night and did not look back at the lamplight in the window, though he wanted to. Christmas in 1878 was a quiet affair for most of Caldwell Creek citizens. The weather had settled into a steady cold that was not brutal but was insistent, and people stayed close to their fires and their families. Warren arrived at the Hurst farm in the early afternoon with a ham he had cured himself, and a small tin of hard candy that he had bought at the general store for Edmund. And he felt, arriving at the door with his coat collar turned up against the cold, something like the nervousness he had not felt since he was considerably younger. Myrtle opened the door before he could knock, which meant she had heard him coming up the path, which meant she had been listening for him, and neither of them acknowledged any of this. The dinner was the finest Christmas he had spent in years. Edmund had contributed a bottle of rye whiskey that he had been saving, and they had ham and roasted potatoes, and a pie that Myrtle had made with dried peaches from the summer. And the house was warm, and the conversation ranged across everything from cattle medicine to the political situation in Washington, to the best methods for preserving vegetables through a hard winter. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Warren looked across the small table at Myrtle, who was laughing at something her father had said. And the feeling he had was not complicated. It was very simple. It was the simplest feeling in the world, actually, which was why it was so large. He did not say anything about it that day. But on the ride home in the cold blue light of Christmas afternoon, he decided what he was going to do about it. He started by asking, in early January, if he could call on her properly. He said it directly, standing in the doorway of the general store where they had both come in on the same errand on the same cold morning, which was not planned but felt somehow appropriate, as most things between them seemed to happen without a great deal of advance arrangement. Myrtle looked at him with those gray-green eyes and the small crease between her brows that appeared when she was thinking carefully about something. "Calling on me properly," she said. "Yes," he said, "with your father's knowledge and your agreement." She was quiet for a moment. Hector Lyle was pretending very intently to organize a shelf behind the counter and not listening at all. "My father already likes you," she said, which was not a yes but was clearly not a no either. "What about you?" Warren asked. She looked at him steadily. "You may call on me," she said, "but I will tell you now that I am not a woman who changes who she is for anyone, and I will not start now." "I know that," Warren said, and he said it in a way that made clear it was part of why he was asking, not something he was overlooking. She nodded once, and that was that. He called on her twice a week through January, coming to the Hurst farm in the late afternoons when the work of the day was done, and sitting at the kitchen table or, on the colder evenings, by the fire and talking. They talked about everything. They argued about a few things, and the arguments were good ones. The kind where both people are genuinely trying to think rather than simply trying to win, and they often came out on the other side having moved slightly from where they started, which was its own kind of intimacy. He helped with the farm work when there was work to be done, not to prove anything, but because it was practical, and because working alongside her felt natural in a way he could not have fully explained. He could read her moods now in the particular way she moved through a task, the set of her shoulders when something was worrying her, the lightness in her step when something had gone well, the specific quality of her silence when she was working through a problem versus the silence she had when she was simply content to be quiet. He had spent his adult life reading animals and weather and land, and he turned the same careful attention to her without quite deciding to do so. Myrtle found that she was not afraid of him, which was not a thing she had been certain about before. She had known men who were charming and turned out to be small when tested, and men who were respected and turned out to be unkind in private, and she had been guarded because she had understood that the only person reliably responsible for her circumstances was herself. But Warren Cooper was consistent, which was what she had not known she was waiting for. He was the same man at the farm as he was in town, the same man when he was proven wrong as when he was right, the same man in an easy conversation as in a difficult one. He did not perform himself for her benefit, and she had not known how hungry she was for that until she found it. In February, they walked together along the frozen creek bank on an afternoon when the sun was out, and the world was bright and cold and still, and he reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they walked for half an hour in the crystalline winter quiet with their breath making small clouds in the cold air. And when they turned back toward the farm, she had his hand in both of hers, and was telling him something about the migratory patterns of the meadowlarks she had observed the previous spring. And he was listening with the complete attention he gave to things that mattered. He kissed her for the first time in March, on the porch of the farmhouse in the early evening when the sky was turning the deep orange and rose of a plain sunset that seemed designed specifically to be beautiful. And she kissed him back in the way that a woman kisses a man when she has thought carefully about it and decided without reservation. Spring came in April like it always does on the Kansas plains, first tentatively, then all at once, with the grasses greening and the cottonwoods budding and the creek running high with the snowmelt from the hills. The new road work began on the northwestern route, which went in without incident and served the town well. Myrtle's fields were untouched, and she and Warren walked them together one April evening looking at the young wheat she had seeded, and she told him what each section would produce if the season was good, and he listened and asked questions that were the right questions, and she thought, not for the first time, that this was a man who genuinely wanted to understand things rather than simply appear to understand them. Edmund Hurst watched all of this from his chair by the fire with the warmth of a man who has been worried about his daughter for a long time and is beginning to believe things might be all right. His health was no better, but it was no worse, and he had developed the talent that people with limited mobility often develop for paying close attention to everything around them. And what he saw in his daughter and the rancher who came to the farm twice a week was something he recognized. He had seen it between himself and Myrtle's mother 30 years ago in Ohio, that particular combination of ease and electricity that is not always present when two people are together, and that is unmistakable when it is. He said nothing about it directly to Myrtle, because she was his daughter and he respected her intelligence, and also because he did not need to. Warren, meanwhile, was having conversations with himself on the long rides between the Double C and the Hurst farm that were becoming increasingly one-sided, because he had already arrived at the answer to the question he was debating. He had known since Christmas that this was where things were going. He had simply been waiting to be sure that she had arrived at the same place, and by April he was fairly certain she had. But Myrtle Hurst was not a woman you assumed things about, and he intended to ask properly and clearly and give her the full opportunity to tell him no if no was what she meant. He asked Edmund first. He rode to the farm on a morning in early May when Myrtle was in town for supplies, and he sat across from Edmund Hurst and said, plainly, that he had come to ask the older man's blessing on courting Myrtle formally toward marriage, if she was willing. He wanted Edmund to know that he did not intend to take Myrtle away from her father or their farm, that whatever arrangement worked for all of them was the one he was committed to finding. Edmund looked at him for a long time with those careful eyes that his daughter had inherited. Then he said, "Warren, my daughter is the most capable person I know, and she has been managing her own affairs and mine for 2 years. My blessing matters to me to give and will matter to her to know I've given, but she is the one you need to ask." "I know," Warren said. "I wanted to ask you first." Edmund nodded, and there was something in his face that was both gladness and the particular bittersweet quality of a father watching his child's life move forward. "Then you have it," he said, "with my whole heart." Warren proposed to Myrtle on a Thursday afternoon in May, standing in the wheat field, which was waist-high now, and moving in the warm wind in long green waves. He said it without preamble, which was his way, and he said it fully, that he loved her and that he wanted to marry her, and that he wanted to build a life with her in which she was fully herself and not a diminished version of herself, and that he had thought carefully about all of this, and he meant every word. Myrtle stood in the wheat field with the warm May wind moving through it and looked at him, and she felt the thing she had been feeling since November rise up and become impossible to contain or categorize any further. She said yes. She said it without hesitation, which for a woman who had spent most of her adult life being careful about everything was its own extraordinary thing. He put his hands on her face and kissed her in the middle of the wheat field with the Kansas sky enormous above them, and she held onto the lapels of his coat and felt, for the first time in a long time, the particular relief of not having to hold everything by herself. The town of Caldwell Creek received the news of the engagement with the speed and enthusiasm that small towns reserve for significant events, and the reaction was generally warm, though predictably not unanimous. There were women who had hoped for Warren Cooper's attention and were disappointed, and there were men who had considered themselves potential suitors for Myrtle and felt privately embarrassed, and there were a few citizens who had not forgiven Myrtle for the town meeting argument, and found private satisfaction in remarking that she had made quite a project of catching the richest rancher in the county. Myrtle was aware of this last category and found it irritating in the way that the opinions of people thinking unfairly are irritating. But she did not let it change anything, because she knew the truth of how things had happened, and Warren knew it, and her father knew it, and those were the people whose understanding mattered. Warren, for his part, heard two men in the Golden Spur Saloon making a comment along those lines one evening in June, and walked over to their table and said, in a very quiet voice, that he would appreciate it if they spoke of his intended with the same respect they would want shown to their own families. And then he went back to his beer without any further discussion of the matter, and there was no further discussion of the matter. The wedding was set for the fall, as these things were often planned, when the harvest work was done, and there was a moment of breath between the labor of summer and the hardship of winter. Specifically, the last Saturday of September, which gave them 4 months to prepare and also gave the wheat time to be brought in, which was not incidental planning on either of their parts. The summer was a good one. The rains came at the right intervals, and Myrtle's fields produced a harvest that was better than either of the previous 2 years. She and Warren worked out the practical arrangements of their future together with the same direct honesty they brought to everything else. The plan was for Myrtle and Edmund to move to the Double C, which was a larger and better equipped property, but for Myrtle's 40 acres to be retained in her name and managed as part of the combined operation. Warren proposed this arrangement himself, because he understood that the land was not simply a financial asset to Myrtle, but represented her father's work and her own, and giving it up entirely would have been a loss of a kind that could not be repaired with money. Myrtle accepted this with the specific gratitude she felt for things that were done thoughtfully, which was a different and deeper gratitude than the ordinary kind. Edmund was pleased by the arrangement and by the practicality of it. His health remained limited but stable. He could not walk far, but on good days he could sit in the yard and supervise with the mild authority of a man who had earned the right to give instructions from a chair. He was looking forward to the move to the larger house, which would give him more room and more company, and he was looking forward to what came after the wedding in the way that grandparents look forward to things they do not say directly. There was one serious difficulty that arose in the summer, and it came from an unexpected direction. A man named Frank Cutter arrived in Caldwell Creek in July with a signed document claiming that he held the title to 20 acres of the Double C's range land, a parcel on the southwestern edge that Warren had believed was part of his deed. Cutter was a lean, sharp-eyed man from Denver who presented his paperwork pleasantly and said he had no intention of troubling anyone. He simply wanted to know whether Cooper would be interested in purchasing the 20 acres outright or preferred to see the matter settled in court. Warren took the document to the land office in Meade and spent 2 days going through the records there with a lawyer, and what they found was complicated. There was a chain of title issue going back 8 years, before Warren had purchased the Double C, in which the previous owner had sold overlapping parcels to 2 different buyers, creating a genuine legal problem. The resolution would be expensive and uncertain. Cutter's claim was not fraudulent, though it was also not rock solid. It was the kind of land dispute that could drag through courts for years. Myrtle, who had taught herself land law because no one else was going to, sat down with the paperwork when Warren brought it back and read through it carefully for 2 evenings. On the 3rd morning, she pointed out a specific clause in the original Double C deed that had been recorded at a county level, rather than territory level, and that under Kansas land statutes as updated in 1872, the county recording took precedence for parcels under 50 acres. It was a narrow technical point, but it was solid, and the Meade lawyer confirmed that she was correct, and when Cutter was informed of this through the appropriate legal channels, his claim became considerably less sustainable. He left Caldwell Creek in August without further incident. Warren looked at Myrtle after all of this was resolved and said, "Where did you learn that?" "The same place I learn most things," she said. "From reading carefully." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement but in something closer to wonderment, and that was one of several moments that summer when he understood with complete certainty what kind of life he was walking into and felt nothing but gratitude for it. September came with the golden light that belongs specifically to that month on the Kansas plains, when the harvested fields glow a particular shade of amber and the sky deepens to a blue that seems to come from somewhere very far away. The wheat was in. The double C cattle were strong, and the fall roundup was planned for the weeks after the wedding. Myrtle and Warren had the kind of busyness that is actually pleasant because it is purposeful, and because both parties know where it is leading. The wedding dress was a practical question that Myrtle addressed with characteristic directness. She could not afford to buy fabric for something elaborate, and she would not have wanted something elaborate anyway. She found a length of ivory-colored cotton at the general store, which was a better material than she usually allowed herself, and the wife of Reverend Pratt, a woman named Clara who had a talent for sewing, offered to help make it into something appropriate. The result was simple and well-made, with a fitted bodice and a full skirt that moved well, and Myrtle looked at herself in the small mirror in her room the night before the wedding and decided it was exactly right. Edmund sat with her that night after the lamp was turned down low, and he told her things about her mother, things she had not heard before, or had heard only partially as a child. He told her about the morning he had asked her mother to marry him, nervous as he had ever been, and the way her mother had said yes as if there had never been another possible answer. He told her that the thing he had understood too late and wanted Myrtle to understand now was that love was not a single feeling but 1,000 daily decisions to choose the same person, and that the man she had chosen was one who would choose her back in the same way every day, and that he was sure of this. Myrtle held her father's hand in the dim light and said, "Thank you for coming west with me." Edmund laughed softly. "You would have come anyway," he said. "I just came along to keep up." The morning of the last Saturday of September was clear and cool and perfect, the kind of morning that Kansas offers as if it knows it has been difficult and wants to make amends. Reverend Pratt's church was full, because Caldwell Creek turned out for weddings with the same enthusiasm it turned out for everything that broke the ordinary rhythm of frontier life, and because both Warren Cooper and Myrtle Hurst were known, and in various degrees, liked and respected. The pews were full of farmers and ranchers and their families, of the women who had helped build the schoolhouse and the men who had worked the cattle drives, of children in their Sunday best who wriggled and were hushed and wriggled again. Warren stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which was dark wool and well-fitting, with his hair cut for the occasion and his boots polished in the way that suggested genuine effort rather than habit. He did not look at the door when it opened. He looked at the floor, the way that men do when they are feeling something large and trying to contain it. And then Jonas, who was standing beside him as a witness, touched his arm lightly, and Warren looked up. Myrtle walked down the aisle of the church on her father's arm, and Edmund Hurst walked slowly and carefully with his cane, moving with the dignity of a man who was determined to do this thing fully. And she walked beside him with her hand on his arm and her chin up and her eyes moving down the aisle until they found Warren, and then they stayed there. Warren felt the large thing in his chest become uncontainable and stopped trying to contain it. They stood together in front of Reverend Pratt and said the words that people have said in those circumstances for centuries, and the words were the same words as always. But they meant something particular to these two people in this particular church on this particular September morning, something about a different road chosen than the one originally proposed, about a woman who stood up and argued when it mattered, about a man who rode to a farm to say he had been wrong, about firewood cut in December and a creek walk in February, and a proposal in a wheat field in May, about all the small daily things that are actually the large things. When Reverend Pratt said, "You may kiss your bride," Warren took both of her hands first and looked at her for a moment, just looked, and she looked back at him with the gray-green eyes that saw clearly, and then he kissed her, and the church made the kind of sound that filled rooms make when people in them are genuinely happy. Edmund Hurst, sitting in the front pew where he had been helped to a seat after giving his daughter away, made no sound at all, but his eyes were bright, and Jonas had to look at the ceiling for a moment to compose himself. The celebration afterward was held in the open air behind the church, which was not yet too cold for such things, with food contributed by half the women in town, and a fiddler named Pete Galloway who played well and knew an enormous number of songs. The afternoon went long and the evening came in slowly, and Warren and Myrtle moved through it together in the way that people move through a celebration that is actually happening rather than being performed, with genuine pleasure and real warmth, and the occasional quiet moment at the edge of things where they stood close together and talked to nobody but each other. Myrtle danced with her father once slowly, with Edmund leaning on his cane and her hand in his, and she kept her face very composed during this because she was her father's daughter and composure was important to her. But the effort cost her something, in the best possible way. Warren danced with her 3 times and tried not to look pleased about it, which was not entirely successful. Jonas, who was 23 and had been quietly in love with the schoolteacher, a young woman named Harriet Wells, found the courage that evening to ask Harriet to walk with him, which she accepted, and which was its own beginning, but that is a different story. The move to the Double C happened in the following week, a practical reorganization of furniture and belongings, and the particular emotional weight of leaving one home for another. Edmund's chair went into the Double C's front room by the fire, and Myrtle's books went onto the shelves in the room she and Warren would share, and the kitchen reorganized itself in the way that kitchens do when a new person takes charge of them, with things moving to where she could find them and making sense in her particular way. Warren's men were respectful and mostly out of the way during all of this, though Jonas helped carry things without being asked, which Myrtle noticed and appreciated. The Double C was a larger operation than the Hurst farm, and Myrtle came into it with both capability and genuine interest, which was not what Warren's hired hands had expected, and which adjusted their opinion of her over the course of the first few weeks. She asked questions about the cattle operation, good questions that came from real curiosity rather than management, and she made changes in the household and the kitchen and the record-keeping that were improvements without being declarations, and she was fair and direct with the men in the way that made everything simpler. Warren watched all of this with a quiet pride that he expressed mostly by asking her what she thought about things, and then actually doing what she suggested when it was the right thing to do, which was more often than not. Winter came back to Kansas with the predictable seriousness of a place that does not apologize for its winters, and the Double C settled into the rhythms of the cold months. Edmund had a good room and a warm fire and more company than he had had in years, and his health, while it did not improve, seemed to stabilize in a way that the doctor from Meade, who came quarterly, attributed to the better conditions and the better spirits. He read from the Bible in the evenings and played checkers with Warren and told stories about Ohio that became richer and more embellished with each telling, which Myrtle pointed out to him, and he denied entirely. It was in the depth of January, the new year of 1879, that Myrtle realized she was going to have a baby. She said nothing for 2 weeks while she made sure of it, going about her work and her days with the particular internal preoccupation of someone carrying a large piece of news carefully. Then she told Warren on a Sunday evening when they were sitting by the fire after Edmund had gone to bed, and the house was quiet, and the wind was pressing against the windows with the persistence that Kansas wind brings to its winter work. She simply said, "We are going to have a baby. In the summer, I think." Warren put down the harness he had been mending and looked at her for a moment, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen before, something entirely new, an openness she did not have words for. He got up from his chair and crossed the room and took her face in his hands again, the way he had on their wedding day, and he said, "Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said, which was true. "Good," he said, and he sat down beside her on the bench and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat together by the fire and listened to the winter wind outside and said very little else, because very little else was necessary. They told Edmund the next morning, and his face did the thing that faces do when they receive exactly the news they were hoping for, and he said nothing at all for a moment, which was unlike him, and then he said, "Your mother would have been so happy," and that was all he needed to say. The spring came again, the green and gold and wide sky spring of the Kansas plains, and Myrtle's wheat fields on the eastern property were planted again by arrangement with one of Warren's hands who needed the work, and the 40 acres continued to produce, as they had always produced, incorporated now into the larger operation, but retained in their particular identity. The new road had been in use since the spring before and was working as promised, connecting Caldwell Creek to Meade with considerably more reliability than the old route had managed. Myrtle went to 2 more town meetings that spring, and she spoke at one of them about the matter of the schoolteacher's salary, which had been proposed to be cut by the school board because the school's enrollment had fluctuated. She made the argument that enrollment fluctuated with the farming seasons, and that cutting the teacher's salary in response to a predictable pattern would simply drive good teachers away to towns that paid fairly, which would be a cost the town would pay a different way for years afterward. The argument was received with more general agreement than opposition this time, which she noted without particular comment. Warren sat in the meeting beside her and said nothing, and she did not need him to, and he understood this precisely. Reverend Pratt's wife, Clara, quietly told 3 women after the meeting that it was a considerable comfort to have someone like Myrtle Hurst in the town, and those 3 women told others, and the sentiment spread in the way that quiet truths sometimes spread, through the ordinary channels of daily life, until it had covered most of the town's population without any announcement. Harriet Wells's salary was maintained at its current level, and she stayed in Caldwell Creek, and Jonah's continued to walk with her in the evenings, and by midsummer they were engaged, though that is indeed a different story. The baby was born in July, on a hot, still morning with the sun already high by the time the doctor from Meade arrived, though in practice he arrived after the fact, because the baby had his own schedule and Myrtle's neighbor Clara Pratt had her practical experience and steady hands, and everything had gone straightforwardly in the end. It was a boy, a solid, healthy boy with dark hair and lungs that announced himself immediately with absolute conviction. Warren was in the house, which was not universally how these things were managed, but was how he managed it, because he had informed Clara Pratt politely but firmly that he intended to be present, and was not available for argument on this point. He held the boy for the first time while Clara helped Myrtle settle, and he looked down at this new person and felt the world rearrange itself around a new center, and it was not a loss of the center it had had before but an expansion, which was the thing nobody had told him, but that was clearly the truth. Myrtle, exhausted and entirely clear-eyed in the way she was exhausted and entirely clear-eyed about everything, reached for the baby, and Warren put him in her arms, and she looked down at the boy, and the expression on her face was something that belonged entirely to her, and to that moment, something he held in his memory afterward like a carefully kept thing. They named him Edmund for her father, and they called him by his full name when he was in trouble and Eddie when he was not, which meant Eddie was what he heard most of the time. Edmund Hurst the elder received the naming with the same silence he had received the announcement of the pregnancy, the silence that is the full expression of something too large for words. He held his grandson with the careful tenderness of a man who knows his hands are not as steady as they once were, and wants to do this one particular thing perfectly. And Eddie slept against his grandfather's chest, as if he had always known where that was. The fall of 1879 was richer than the fall before in every sense. The cattle market was good. The wheat had done well. The Double C's finances were more solid than they had been in several years, partly because Warren was a capable rancher, and partly because Myrtle had reorganized the accounts and identified 3 places where money had been being lost without anyone quite noticing. She did this without drama, and presented the findings to Warren over breakfast one morning, as if they were simply interesting information, which they were, and which also happened to save them a significant amount of money annually. Warren told Jonas, in a private moment, that marrying a woman smarter than himself was the best decision he had ever made, and Jonas nodded seriously and said he was keeping that in mind. Eddie grew the way babies grow, with the startling speed that is always surprising no matter how many babies one has observed. And he was a cheerful boy with his mother's directness, expressed in the form of very clear opinions about what he wanted at any given moment, and a willingness to make those opinions known. Warren's hired hands became collectively fond of him in the way that men in outdoor work become fond of children, with a rough tenderness that expressed itself in whittled toys and patient horseback rides, and the kind of attention that is given freely because it is genuinely felt. Edmund Sr. spent his days in the front room with his chair and his Bible and his grandson, and when Eddie was old enough to sit upright and respond to stories, Edmund told him Ohio stories that Myrtle was fairly certain were more embellished than ever, but which she could not quite bring herself to correct, because the sound of her father's voice telling them and her son's face listening to them was something she wanted to preserve rather than interrupt. In the spring of 1880, Myrtle discovered she was pregnant again, and this time she told Warren immediately, over breakfast, with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who has done this before and knows exactly what she is doing. Warren looked up from his coffee. "Summer again. Autumn, I think," she said. He smiled at her across the table, and she looked back at him with the dry affection that was one of the languages they spoke best, and Eddie, sitting in his wooden chair between them with porridge on his face, said something emphatic that was not quite words yet but conveyed a clear general attitude. The second child, born in October of 1880, was a girl, and they named her Ruth, which had been Myrtle's mother's name, and which pleased Edmund so much that he stayed awake half the night just sitting in the front room being quietly glad about it. Ruth was different from Eddie from the beginning, quieter and more observant, watching the world from her mother's arms with eyes that seemed to be compiling information for later use. She had Warren's coloring, dark-haired and brown-eyed, and something in the particular way she tilted her head when she was thinking reminded Myrtle so entirely of Warren that it was sometimes startling. The Double C grew through 1880 and into 1881. Warren expanded the cattle operation carefully, without overextending, adding acreage on the northern side where the grass was good, and hiring 2 more men, one of them a young man from Oklahoma Territory named Samuel, who turned out to be exceptionally good with horses, and who Myrtle hired for the household as well as the ranch because he was honest and capable and needed steady work. Caldwell Creek itself was growing, as Kansas towns grew in those years, with new families arriving and new buildings going up, and the ordinary expansion of a place that has established itself as a place worth coming to. A second general store opened, and a doctor set up a small practice permanently rather than the irregular visits from Meade they had relied on before, and a woman named Gertrude Marsh started a small lending library in her front room that Myrtle contributed to enthusiastically with books ordered from a catalog, and that quickly became one of the things she was most pleased about in the whole town. She and Gertrude became friends of the specific kind that form between 2 women who both read seriously and have things to say about what they have read, and the friendship was a pleasure to both of them and also had the secondary effect of improving the town's library considerably. Because when Myrtle wanted a book and contributed it to the lending collection, it was usually a book worth having. In 1881, Myrtle was asked to join the school board, and she accepted. She served for 3 years with the same directness and fairness that she brought to everything, and she argued for the school's resources with the same tenacity she had brought to her father's fields at that first town meeting, and the school benefited. Jonas and Harriet were married in the spring of 1881, in the same church where Myrtle and Warren had married, with Warren as witness and Myrtle among the guests, and it was a good day that the whole town enjoyed. Edmund Hurst turned 61 in the summer of 1881, and his health, which had been stable for several years, began to decline in the fall. The doctor, whose name was Henry Park and who was a careful and honest man, told Myrtle in September that Edmund's heart was working harder than it should, and that they should expect a gradual slowing. He was not in pain. He was simply wearing down, the way a well-built machine wears down after many years of good service. Myrtle managed this knowledge with the same composure she had managed everything difficult in her life, which was to say she managed it during the day, and allowed herself to feel it in full in the evenings when the children were asleep and the house was quiet. Warren was there in those evenings with the particular quality of presence that she had come to rely on completely, not fixing things, because this was not fixable, but being entirely there, which was the thing she needed. Edmund spent his last months with his daughter and her family in his chair by the fire, with his grandson sitting beside him and his granddaughter on his knee when she would sit still for it, which was not always. He told stories and read his Bible and played checkers, and watched his family move through the rooms of the house, with the patient, grateful attention of a man who knows he has been fortunate. He died on a Tuesday morning in January of 1882, quietly, in his chair by the fire, with Myrtle sitting beside him holding his hand, which she had not left since the previous evening when she had understood from the quality of his breathing that this was coming. Warren was on the other side, and the children were in their beds still asleep. It was before sunrise, and the house was very quiet, and Edmund Hurst went out of the world as peacefully as a man could go out of it, without struggle or distress. Myrtle sat with him for a while afterward in the pre-dawn quiet, and then Warren made her stand up and come away, gently, with his hands on her shoulders, and she went with him because she trusted him to know when it was time. The funeral was attended by most of Caldwell Creek, because Edmund Hurst had been known and liked in the town, and because his daughter was known and respected, and because people understand these losses and come to say so. Reverend Pratt spoke well and truthfully about a man who had come west in his 50s with a daughter and a willingness to work, and who had done good work in the years he had. Myrtle stood at the graveside in the cold January air with Warren's hand in hers and Eddie holding her other hand and Ruth in Warren's arms, and she felt the loss completely, which was the only way to feel it, and she did not hide from it. She cried at the graveside in the open air in front of the whole town, and nobody thought less of her for it, and she did not care what anyone thought about it anyway. Warren held her that night for a long time after the children were in bed, and she let herself be held in the full weight of it, and in the morning she got up and made breakfast and went on, because that was what you did, and because Edmund had raised her to go on. The grief settled over the following months into the particular form that grief takes when it has been fully felt, a shape that is permanent but that makes room for everything else to continue. Myrtle kept her father's chair by the fire, and sometimes in the evenings she sat in it rather than her own, and Warren never said anything about this, and she loved him for that. Spring of 1882 came with the particular sweetness that comes after a hard winter, and Myrtle's wheat fields, tended now by Samuel under her direction, greened up beautifully. The Double C's cattle were healthy and the market was strong. Eddie was 2.5 and had learned to run, which he did constantly and in all directions. Ruth was 18 months and had developed opinions about everything, which she expressed with impressive volume for someone of her size. Warren looked at his family at the supper table one April evening, the two children in various states of managed chaos, the wheat fields visible through the window in the last evening light, Myrtle across the table telling Eddie with patient firmness that beans were not intended to be used as projectiles, and he felt the specific happiness that is made of small, ordinary things accumulated into something extraordinary. He had been, before all of this, a capable man who lived a capable life, and did his work well, and was respected and entirely without the specific weight that comes from loving someone so completely that the world is organized differently around them. He had not known what he was missing, because he had not known it was possible to have it, and so the finding of it had been a particular kind of grace. Myrtle looked up from the bean negotiation and caught him looking at her, and she gave him the small private smile that belonged only to this context, between the two of them, and then returned her attention to the very serious matter of educating Eddie about the proper relationship between food and projectiles. The summer of 1882 was long and hot and good. The cattle drives were profitable. The wheat was excellent. Myrtle found herself, in the late August evenings when the work was done and the children were bathed and asleep, and the house was quiet, sitting on the porch with Warren and looking at the Kansas sky, which put on a show every evening of stars that seemed unreasonably generous, and thinking about what she wanted for the years ahead. She wanted more children, probably. She wanted the school to keep improving. She wanted Gertrude Marsh's lending library to grow large enough to need its own building. She wanted Warren to keep looking at her the way he did. She wanted to watch Eddie become a person, and Ruth become a person, and see who they turned out to be. She wanted to be in this particular place, on this particular earth, with this particular man for all the years that were available to her. In September of 1882, exactly 4 years after the wedding, she discovered she was pregnant for the third time, and she told Warren in the evening on the porch under the stars, and he laughed with a warmth that was entirely genuine and pulled her close, and they sat together under the Kansas sky and talked about what they hoped for this new person, who they did not know yet but were already glad to be expecting. The baby, a boy they named James, arrived in the spring of 1883, and the household reorganized itself again around the new addition with the practiced efficiency of a family that had done this before, which meant there was chaos, but it was familiar chaos, and everyone knew their role in it. Eddie, who was now almost 4, took the new baby with the serious proprietorship of a firstborn, and was found more than once sitting beside the cradle explaining things to James in a low lecturing tone that was so precisely reminiscent of Myrtle that Warren had to leave the room. Ruth, who was 2, was less certain about James and was more or less resolved on her own schedule and requirements, which were considerable. She would come around, Myrtle said, and she was right, as she generally was, and by summer Ruth had appointed herself the baby's guardian in a way that was simultaneously bossy and deeply tender, which seemed about right for who she was becoming. The years settled into themselves the way years do, in a place where life is built rather than passed through. Caldwell Creek grew and changed and grew some more. New families came, old families expanded. The school grew to need a second teacher, and the argument for that second teacher was made at a town meeting by Myrtle Cooper, whose town meeting speeches had by now become something the citizens of Caldwell Creek had learned to attend to, because they were always prepared and direct and generally right, and the town was usually better off for having listened. Warren ran the Double C with increasing skill and confidence, and Myrtle was his partner in it in the full sense of that word, involved in the financial decisions and the long-term planning and the particular problems that arose, as problems always arose, requiring the kind of thinking that benefited from 2 minds rather than one. They disagreed sometimes, in the productive way that people who think seriously and have different perspectives disagree, and they resolved those disagreements in the same way they had resolved every other difficulty between them, by being honest with each other until they found the place where both of them could see clearly. They had built something. This was the word that came to Myrtle sometimes in the early mornings before the children were up, and the household was still quiet, when she stood in the kitchen making the first pot of coffee and looking at the gray-pink dawn coming through the window. They had built something with these years and this land and this work, something that was more than the sum of its parts, a life that was genuinely good in the ways that mattered, not easy, because the plains were not easy and the work was not easy, and the loss of her father had not been easy, but good in the way that things are good when they are true. Warren came downstairs in those early mornings and found her with the coffee and the quiet, and he poured his own cup and stood beside her at the window, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both were fine. This was the thing she had not known to hope for when she was 26 and running her father's farm alone, the specific comfort of a person beside you who knows you completely and is glad of it. In the fall of 1885, when Eddie was 6 and Ruth was 4 and James was 2.5, Warren took the whole family to a harvest fair in Meade that was the largest gathering any of them had attended, with hundreds of people and livestock competitions and a traveling show, and enough food to feed the entire county twice over. Eddie won a ribbon for the best decorated hat in the children's competition, a category he had entered without telling either of his parents, and he received the ribbon with the absolute solemnity of someone who has accomplished something genuinely important. Myrtle held the ribbon afterward and looked at her son, and felt the particular pride that parents feel when their children turn out to have their own ideas and their own confidence, separate from anything the parents have done. She looked across the fair at Warren, who was lifting James up to see the horses in the competition ring, and James was pointing at the horses with the fierce intensity of a child in love with something, and Warren was pointing with him, and saying the names of the different breeds with the same patience he brought to everything that mattered. The sun was doing what the Kansas sun did in October, turning everything amber and gold, and the smell of the fair was hay and animals and cooking, and Eddie was holding his ribbon and asking Ruth what she thought about it, and Ruth was telling him at considerable length. This was the life, all of it. This specific, ordinary, irreplaceable collection of moments and people and seasons. Myrtle Hurst had stood up at a town meeting in October of 1878 and told Warren Cooper he was wrong, and he had come to her farm a week later to say so. And 7 years later they stood in a Kansas fairground in the autumn sunshine with 3 children and a life that was fuller than either of them had imagined when they were standing at the beginning of it. She walked across the fair to where Warren was standing with James, and Warren looked over when she came close, and she took his free hand, and they stood together watching the horses in the ring, and James pointed at a particularly large bay and said something that was mostly enthusiasm and partly his father's name, and Warren said, "Yes, that is a very good horse." And Myrtle thought about the first town meeting, and the apology and the coffee and the fence repair, and the creek walk, and the wheat field, and the wedding and the children and her father's chair by the fire, and everything that had grown from a woman standing up and saying what she thought. She would not have changed any of it. Not a single word. In the years that followed, the Double C continued to thrive and expand carefully under their combined management. Eddie grew into a boy who was equal parts his mother's precision and his father's patience, and who by age 8 could ride a horse with skill that made the ranch hands respectful. Ruth grew into a girl who read everything she could reach and had opinions about all of it, which delighted Myrtle and occasionally startled everyone else. James grew into a sunny, determined child who was devoted to animals in a manner that suggested a future as either a rancher or a veterinarian, depending on how things developed. Warren taught all 3 of them to ride and to read cattle, and to respect the land in the way that it needed to be respected. Myrtle taught them to read and to think clearly and to say what they meant, and she brought them to the schoolhouse in Caldwell Creek and knew both teachers personally and asked detailed questions about how each child was doing. And the teachers understood clearly that Myrtle Cooper's interest in the school was not casual. They had, in later years, one more child, a daughter born in 1887 who they named Clara, after the woman who had helped make the wedding dress and who had been the first person to hold her when she arrived in the world. Clara Pratt cried when they told her and said it was not necessary, and accepted the honor with the genuine emotion of someone who has been given something meaningful. Clara was the youngest and came into a household that was already in full running, with 3 older siblings to absorb all available attention, and she navigated this with the practical creativity of a child who understands her position and works with it rather than against it. She was fair-haired, which was unexpected in a family of dark-haired people, and Myrtle said she must take after a grandmother neither of them had known, which was probably true. Warren Cooper turned 40 in 1886, and Myrtle organized a gathering for him at the Double C that included most of the people they knew in the county, which was now considerably more people than had attended their wedding 8 years earlier, because the years had built friendships and connections, and the ordinary dense web of relationships that forms when people stay in a place and work alongside each other through all of the seasons. Jonas and Harriet were there with their 2 children, and Jonas gave a speech that made Warren laugh and which was only slightly embarrassing. Gertrude Marsh was there with the latest catalog of books she had ordered for the lending library. Reverend Pratt and Clara were there. Samuel, who had been with the ranch for 6 years now, was there. Most of the hired hands were there. It was a full, warm, noisy gathering that spilled out of the house and into the yard in the October afternoon light, and Myrtle stood at the edge of it at one point and watched it with the feeling she sometimes had of seeing things very clearly, as if from a slight distance. And what she saw was that this man she had married had made something real here, with his work and his fairness and his willingness to build rather than simply occupy, and that she had been part of it and he had been part of what she had built. And they were not separate stories but the same story, which was how it should be. She walked back into the middle of it and found Warren talking to 3 men about the cattle market, and she brought him a plate of food because he always forgot to eat at social occasions, and he took it with the specific domestic gratitude of a man who has been married long enough to know that this is love in action, and he caught her hand for a moment before she went back to the other guests, and held it, and then let her go. Eddie Cooper, in later years when he was grown and had his own family, would sometimes be asked what it had been like to grow up the way he had, and he would say that what he remembered most clearly was not the ranch or the cattle or the particular facts of frontier life, but the quality of the house itself, the feeling of it, which was a feeling of people who were genuinely glad to be in each other's company, who worked together and argued sometimes and laughed often and took the difficult things seriously without being crushed by them. He remembered his mother standing at the kitchen window in the early morning with her coffee, watching the dawn come. He remembered his father bringing her the second cup without being asked. He remembered the sound of them talking in the evenings when he was supposed to be asleep, the low, steady sound of 2 people who had things to say to each other and the time to say them. He remembered the way his mother stood up in the town meeting, when he was old enough to attend and to understand what he was watching, with her back straight and her voice clear, and the way his father sat beside her and never tried to speak for her or over her, and he understood that this was what respect looked like in practice, not as a sentiment but as a daily thing, as real and necessary as any of the work that kept the ranch going. The town of Caldwell Creek grew through the 1880s and into the 1890s in the way that Kansas towns grew in those decades, with more people and more services, and the increasing connectivity of a region that the railroad was reshaping. The Double C remained one of the largest operations in the area, and Warren and Myrtle managed the changes with the same combination of careful attention and genuine flexibility that had served them in the beginning. The Eastern Road, the one that had been the cause of everything between them, was improved twice more in the years that followed, and the route that had been chosen, the Northwestern one, proved itself the right choice every spring when the other option would have been impassable. Myrtle never mentioned this at town meetings because it did not need mentioning. It simply was. On a September evening in 1888, the 10th anniversary of the town meeting where everything had begun, Myrtle and Warren sat on the porch of the Double C after the children were in bed, in the warm dark of a late summer night with the stars doing their extravagant Kansas best. The air smelled of dry grass and distant rain and the last of the summer heat. Warren said, "10 years ago this week you stood up in Pratt's church and told me I was wrong." "You were wrong," Myrtle said. "I was," he agreed. She leaned against his shoulder in the dark. "I did not think anything of you particularly that night," she said. "I was thinking about the road." "I know," Warren said. "I thought about you for a week afterward." She looked up at him in the dark. "You never told me that. You never asked." She considered this. "What were you thinking about?" "That you had said, 'I am not against a better road, I am against an unfair one,'" he said, "and that it was exactly right, and that I wanted to know more about the person who would stand up in a room full of people and say exactly the right thing." Myrtle was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And do you know more about that person?" "I know everything about her," Warren said, "and I want more time to know what I don't yet." She took his hand in the dark, and they sat on the porch of the house they had built together, with their children asleep inside and the ranch stretched out around them and the Kansas night enormous and full of stars, and the life they had made settled around them like something permanent and good, not perfect, because nothing was perfect, but true and theirs and more than enough. The morning always came. The coffee was always made. The work was always there. The children grew. The seasons turned. The cattle moved through the good grass, and the wheat came up green each spring, and the sky above the Kansas plains was wide enough to hold everything. The grief and the hope and the ordinary sacred dailiness of two people who had chosen each other at a town meeting, and a fence line, and a kitchen table, and a wheat field, and kept choosing each other through every season that came after. Myrtle Hurst had argued with the cowboy at a town meeting in the fall of 1878, and he had married her that same fall, and it was the best argument either of them had ever made or ever lost, depending on how you counted such things, and they both counted it as entirely one.